Aryan forefathers as the flag bearers of the supreme race all over the world. Does that make more sense? No? And it's batshit crazy? Yeah, I know, but stick with me, it gets even wilder. So we have problem numero uno. If not all Germans are Nordic, therefore not all of them are Aryans. You must be thinking, the Germans probably swept that under the rug, though, right? Surprisingly, no, not really. It was commonly accepted among the Nazis that many of the so-called Alpine race had mixed up with the Nordics in their country, as they estimated that the Germans themselves are around 50% Nordic. After they came to power, there was, and check this out, a genuine debate inside the Nazi party between super racists and just racists on whether or not a German race as a concept existed.
Fuck me? No, fuck you! Hey, fuck you, Tabernacle! Fuck you! Fuck you!
The ultra-racist had won out the argument by defining the idea of a German race as having no basis in blood, as they are a mixture of other races as well as a potentially weakening concept because it might allow certain lower races to self-identify as German only because of a shared culture or language, and through that could weaken the country. Germans were therefore a folk, a people, a nation, but definitely not a race. Some were still worried this might imply segregation inside of the German population itself, if Nordicism was to overtake Germanism as the preliminary identity. Then they feared they might come to a situation in which the Nordics were to ostracize the rest of the German populace. But that was quickly forgotten, because there were other enemies to fight first. Once the debate was finished, they slapped the "We are 50% Nordic" sticker on their racist car and said, "This is what we're rolling with." But if they were 50% Nordic, then what about other so-called whites, like the English, for example, or the Swedes? Well, and I kid you not, nations were cut into two categories: lower and higher Aryan classes, based on percentages. Yes, completely made up percentages of how much of the local population was Nordic, and therefore if it could be consolidified in the local blood pool through careful breeding or not. The Finns were 80% Nordic, putting them in the "oh my god, so white" category, while the English, for example, were believed to be 25% Nordic, where only the higher classes, for some reason, preserved most of their Nordic blood. This insane guesswork required as much scientific research as being like, okay, there's some blonde people over in England, but not so many, so let's say 25%? And oh my god, look at Finland, you can't even see these dudes when the sun is shining bright. Let's give those guys like an 80% Nordic rating. And yes, this percentage game was what defined people as more or less Aryan and therefore more or less tolerable by the great German nation. Those with higher percentages were to be eventually fully Germanized and welcomed into the fold of the Third Reich. While the rest, well, we know what the plan was for the rest. So okay, but how does one actually tell between two blonde dudes if one is an Aryan or if one is Jewish or Slavic? Well, for the Jewish question, they had a very direct answer. The Nuremberg laws passed in 1935 came up with this brilliant idea. Those with 3 or more Jewish grandparents were 100% Jews, no discussion or debate. When identifying the race of your parents or grandparents, they looked both at their religious practices as well as information on their ethnic belonging. But if you were a Catholic with Jewish ancestry, they wouldn't care about your rejection of the Hebrew religion because it was quote-unquote in your blood. Those with only 1 or 2 Jewish descendants were considered race mixers and were partially tolerated only in the beginning. These blood rules applied to Jews, Roma, and Black Germans, and eventually led to their documents regularly being stamped with their ethnic information, as to not allow them to marry, run businesses, employ non-Jews, and at some point to even exist. The craziest part about German Nazi race laws is that they were less harsh than American segregation rules. In the US, the one-drop rule meant that even if a single person in your entire family tree was black, you were no longer white. Well, the Nazis at least gave some leeway to breeding out inferiority in your so called system. So, what about my people, the Slavs? Well, the Nazis thought that Eastern Europe, namely the areas whose inhabitants speak Slavic languages, were racially the lowest part of the continent and very distinct from the rest of Europe. Hans Gunther, the daddy of German race science, stated, "The east of Germany shows a gradual transition." Okay, I'll stop this. Gradual transition of the racial mixtures of Central Europe into predominantly East Baltic and Inner Asiatic regions. Owing to the likeness between East Baltic and Inner Asiatic bodily characters, it will often be hard to fix a sharp boundary between these two races. Russia was thought to be around 25% Nordic, while other regions were considered less or more Nordic. But at the end of the day, they were seen as inherently impossible places to Aryanify or to Germanize, because they were already too mixed or spoiled by so-called evils of Bolshevik communism or unclean blood. There were still Nordics there and could be found through incredibly advanced skull measuring. Yes, this is a joke, but potentially losing them was a worthy sacrifice in order to crush the beast in the east and establish the infamous Lebensraum. A space for the German nation to grow and live, but most importantly, a place to breed all aspects of non-Nordic Aryanhood out of the populace. So the answer to the question from the beginning of the video should now be clear. There were some so-called Aryans living among dirty Slavs that the Germans believed should be saved and brought to Germany as kids for Germanization. And that's exactly what they did. Weird how they shot the parents of these so-called Aryan kids immediately after kidnapping them, though. Himmler stated that it was in the German interest to discover as many ethnic groups in the East and splinter them as much as possible, find and select racially valuable children to be sent to Germany to assimilate, and restrict non-Germans in the general government and conquer territories to four-grade elementary school, which would only teach them how to write their own name, to count up to 500, and to obey Germans. Himmler believed that the Germanization process in Eastern Europe would be complete when, and I quote, "in the East dwell only men with truly Germanic blood." The end destiny for the East in the long run was slavery followed by complete annihilation. But then, why did we see so many representatives of these lower races being incorporated in the so-called German military movement? Maybe, and hear me out, it wasn't even about saving members of their own race, but finding a way to not sound like hypocrites once they started realizing that Stalin's Reds were wiping the floor with them. And what about incorporating other races into the Reich? What was that about? I'm not even going to attempt and explain the concept of honorary Aryans, which was often gifted to the Japanese and the Chinese, or the Iranian Aryans, or how the Nazis literally believed that Indian higher castes who ruled and still rule India were descendants of Aryans, which allowed them to rule over their subhuman dominion. All of this would genuinely require an additional video, so let's keep ourselves geographically locked on the European continent. Hitler's great allies, the Italians, are a great place to start. A great culture which has given us things like the mafia, gabagool, and Italian Americans. They often debated the concept of Nordicism. The same racists which considered their population majority Nordic believed Italy, as well as parts of Spain, were a people of a Mediterranean race, not as clever or entrepreneurial as the Nordics, but with higher proclivity towards creativity and still inherently Aryan, but definitely not to the same extent. This bugged Mussolini for a long time, who, as a bold, chubby, brownish dude, was against such ideals for pretty obvious reasons.